Won't You Be My Neighbor, directed by Morgan Neville, is a documentary film that accounts the journey and work of Mr. Rogers, the creator of the hit children's TV show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The documentary focuses on the ideals and guiding principles behind the icon Fred Rogers and what he sought to do for children through his TV show. His message, as radical as it was considered by many at the time, was that each child was perfect the way they are, and they deserve to be loved as they are. In his efforts to connect with children in a more meaningful way, Mr. Rogers attempted to be a calming voice in a divisive time. Alright, so I don't actually review many documentaries. I'm thinking this may actually be the first documentary I've ever reviewed, so that's pretty cool, I guess. You guys are seeing something new from me. Also, you're seeing me in a sweater because I just kind of thought, it's Mr. Rogers, have a sweater, it's, timely and topical and all those kind of things. I don't think you've ever seen me in a sweater before, so there's something else you haven't seen before. Either way, I got lucky that this is my first documentary review because this is truly an excellent one. This is a film that I believe almost anyone can enjoy, regardless of whether you really know much about Mr. Rogers or you grew up on Mr. Rogers or anything like that. Mr. Rogers was a little bit before my time, considering I was born in '91, but that doesn't mean I didn't know who he was and what Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was. He's a legend and a TV icon, and he still is beloved for a reason. But what this documentary does is just further clarify how important Mr. Rogers was to his time and what honestly he was all about. The whole documentary operates on footage from a variety of different time periods, from the start of the show, Mr. Rogers and his crew behind the scenes during the show, interviews with him once the show is concluded, everything pretty much. And it was great to just understand what guided him and what directed him towards creating the show that was just so incredibly different than everything else on TV. As entertainment was getting faster paced and more frantic, Mr. Rogers did the opposite for kids. He slowed things down and he spoke softly and calmly to them on their level. There's a point in the documentary where one of the interview subjects says that Mr. Rogers took all the aspects of a good television show and did the opposite. Instead of high energy, high budget excitement to match the high energy levels of kids, he took a slow, methodical approach with low budget sets. He was more focused on providing something meaningful than he was providing mindless entertainment. That's what's interesting about Mr. Rogers though. He was a pioneer because he had a vision. He saw a void that existed where kids around the country just weren't hearing the things they needed to hear, and it was hindering their growth, something that he went through himself. He sought to fill that void by helping kids try to make sense of seriously difficult issues. He talked about things like divorce, racism, assassinations, disabilities, and other important topics like that. This documentary really hones in on just how his message was and still is a pretty unique one, and how that message truly made a difference in a lot of people's lives, especially kids. It's actually cool how they do it because in order to understand the true reach of the show, you need context. You need to understand Fred Rogers himself. And you need to understand the time in which he existed and operated. There's a lot of exploration here into Fred Rogers' family and his backstory, and also, of course, historical events that help guide the content of the show. It's also easy for the viewer to just go to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood because the documentary paints an extremely vivid picture. I will warn you though, this documentary definitely gets pretty emotional. I didn't end up crying, but I can't say I wasn't close a lot of times. There's moments that just tug at your heartstrings because of how much kindness and compassion is coming from Fred Rogers when seemingly no one else would show it. I think what this documentary showed me was that a lot of times we don't go that extra mile for one another to even show the slightest compassion and support for each other when it's most needed. There's people who were close to Fred Rogers and he supports and nurtures them in a way that no one else in their lives would. That's where it gets emotional, because you basically see people whose lives are just drastically altered positively because of a little kindness that Fred Rogers offered them when no one else would. This is even the case with the kids as well, because Mr. Rogers believed that kids were being force-fed a diet of sugary entertainment, a diet that contained a deficiency of love, respect, and compassion, which were really important to him. What's interesting about that is that this documentary shows you how effective his methods were at reaching kids and helping them also just understand complex topics, and also just helping them feel happier and more secure as they're navigating their way through childhood, which is really difficult. It almost feels like we need a Mr. Rogers 2.0 in today's world, considering how divisive everything is. We need that calming force to slow things down and to get us talking with one another again instead of shouting each other down. There's only one thing I didn't quite love about this documentary. There's obviously a lot of interviews happening here because it's a documentary and that's pretty standard for a documentary, but for some reason the filmmakers decided to have a lot of the interview subjects look directly into the camera. I'm guessing this was to emulate how Mr. Rogers looked directly into the camera and spoke to his audience, but in a documentary of this format, it just feels a little bit jarring sometimes. You'll eventually get used to it. It's not like a total immersion killer or a breaker of anything like that, but there's still moments where the emotion feels a little bit more manufactured by having the interview subjects look directly into the camera. But in the end, Won't You Be My Neighbor is an excellent documentary, and it tells a compelling story about a television icon who just provided a voice of reason in a difficult time. I highly recommend you check this one out. It's definitely one of the best documentaries I've probably ever seen. As for the pros cons, I thought Won't You Be My Neighbor delivered a very compelling historical documentary story, tons of emotion and immersion, a very vivid picture of the setting itself, and some intriguing interviews about the man himself and his iconic show. As for the cons, just the interview subjects looking directly into the camera. It's a bit jarring. Overall, I'm going to give Won't You Be My Neighbor a 9.5 out of 10 and definitely recommend you check it out in theaters if you enjoy documentaries in the slightest. You don't have to have seen the TV show to enjoy this one. So did you guys see Won't You Be My Neighbor yet? What did you think of it? And if not, let me know why not. And also let me know if you grew up watching Mr. Rogers or not. I was born in 91, so like I said, he was a little bit before my time. I still really love this documentary though. It's super well done and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. Either way, this is WillFoxification signing off. See you in the next review.